Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law. I hope you are having a good day. And today we are doing a story that was requested by a couple people because they want to see me suffer. We're doing this story in the Atlantic called Internet Speech Will Never Go Back to Normal. In the debate over freedom versus control of the global network, China was largely correct and the U.S. was wrong. This was written by two law professors, Jack Goldsmith at Harvard Law School and Andrew Keene Woods, professor of law at the University of Arizona College of Law. Okay. So I have not read this article. I saw the title. We've done one with the Atlantic before where we did the whole new conservatism thing, and we said that was a bunch of BS. So I have not read this article. I'm going to read it with you and share my pain. So you guys amongst yourselves can start a betting pool on which is more likely, me making it to the end of this article or me dying. And then you can take prop bets. If I die, will it be because of heart attack or a blood clot or a stroke? Or maybe it'll be epilepsy, even though I've never had an epileptic seizure ever. Maybe I'll have my first one ever, and it'll be so bad that I'll die as a result of that. So you can take bets on how this will kill me. That'll be good. And of course, because there's no way I'm making it through this otherwise, I am drinking bourbon. I know it's in a wine glass. It's bourbon. And it's fantastic. And it will make the pain go away. All right, let's read this and try to explain this to them. I feel like anyone who's calling for censorship has an inherent problem. It's an inherently self-contradictory position. Because you say, I'd like censorship. And then what I do is I say, I agree with you, and the first thing we should censor is you. Ta-da! That's the problem, right? It's an inherently contradictory position. Only good people will be allowed to speak. Well, if that were true, you definitely wouldn't be allowed to speak. Freedom of speech is the very thing that's allowing you to write this trash article. So I will defend freedom of speech for your right to say really stupid things. And I'll point out that it's really, really stupid. And perhaps during this, question my commitment to freedom of speech as a value because I have to put up with really, really stupid things. But I'll try to remind myself that them being allowed to say stupid things means everyone can say stupid things. And that's, probably a good thing. So then we don't have to have someone figure out what is stupid and what is not. That's probably for the best. But we'll see how far we get. All right. Let us read this article that was published in the Atlantic. Also, I'd like to point out this wasn't the only stupid article written in the Atlantic recently. They also came out with one, I think, written yesterday or today, which said that Georgia is sacrificing people on the altar of the economy. I forget the exact title, but it was pretty blatant. And so we might have to cover that later because no, just none of those things. But right now we're going to do freedom of speech. Okay. COVID-19 has emboldened American tech platforms to emerge from their defensive crouch. Before the pandemic, there were targets of public outrage over the life under their dominion. And, still kind of now, even more now, the very fact that Susan Wojcicki, CEO of YouTube, says you can't put up information on YouTube if it contradicts the WHO, including two doctors, who are emergency room personnel, who went forward with their opinion of they think that this whole thing is overblown. Their opinion was taken down. Two practicing doctors who gave the talk while wearing scrubs. Their opinion was taken down because it doesn't comport with the WHO. Great. Today, the platforms are proudly collaborating with one another, which, could be an antitrust violation depending on what we're doing, and following government guidance to censor harmful ideas related to the coronavirus. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be censoring your harmful idea, which is very, very sad. And they're using their prodigious data collection capabilities in coordination with federal and state governments to impose contact tracing, quarantine enforcement, and other health measures. As Microsoft's, apologize, well, not that it really matters, but either way. As Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg recently boasted, the world has faced pandemic before us, but this time we have a new superpower, the ability to gather and share data for good. Yeah, no, I can't really get behind this. That we're censoring views of other people. It's just not really working for me. It's yeah, this is not in keeping with the First Amendment tradition we know and love. Yeah, it's a little bit problematic. Civil rights groups are tolerating these measures. Emergency times call for emergency measures, but also urging a swift return to normal when the virus ebbs. Well, they're a little unclear there what they mean by tolerating these measures. What measures are they referring to? Because we've been talking about private action up to this point. And I feel like these article people are doing a little sleight of hand here, right? Because we've been talking about private action, about these private groups and doing stuff. And then they say civil rights groups are tolerating these measures. Well, what measures? Do they mean the private measures that they just talked about? Or do they mean the public measures that the government is doing? I suspect the authors mean the public measures the government is doing. So even though they didn't really mention the government up to this point, when they say the civil rights groups are tolerating these measures, I think they're doing a little red herring. They're doing a little straw man, doing a little confusing the issue. Gonna try to slide that government action right in through the DMs there in the background and hope no one notices. But they're also urging a swift return to normal when the virus ebbs. We need to, quote, make sure that when we've passed this crisis, our country isn't transformed into a place we don't want to live, warns the American Civil Liberty Union, Jan Stanley. Yeah, the ACLU has been pretty good on First Amendment rights. Every once in a while, they do something to really irritate me on constitutional issues I think they should stand for. Most recently, it's not that recent at this point, but it was the last thing of note where I stopped being an ACLU member, because from time to time I've been an ACLU member and not. And so I'll tell you what made me become not an ACLU member most recently. And it's been a while, but yeah. Anyways, there was one of the indictments with one of the officers who had been accused of killing an unarmed black man. I can't remember exactly which incident it was. I want to say it was Freddie Gray, but it doesn't really matter. It was one of those incidents a couple of years ago where there's a lot of those things that were happening at the same time. And the grand jury decided not to indict. Now, there can be a whole lot of reasons for that. That the prosecutor soft-pedaled the case, that they didn't want to be, that it was, turned into a thing, so there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But what the ACLU wrote in their membership email, immediately responding to that, I interpreted to be written in such a way as the ACLU saying there was only one possible proper thing for the grand jury to do, which was to indict. And I thought that was a little weird because the ACLU, remind you, defends civil liberties. They're all about individual member rights, or that's like what they're supposed to be, right? So the ACLU, you would think, as an organization, would be defending the cops' rights to due process, and would be defending that happen. Now, there's a lot of ways to criticize it, but they weren't criticizing it in a way I thought was proper. They seem to be criticizing it because they seem to be saying, in my judgment, that the only proper possible outcome was an indictment. And that would defy the point of due process, right? If the only possible result is one thing, then you're saying, well, this part of the process shouldn't exist because it only can come out one way, which seemed to be antithetical to what the ACLU was standing for. So that's just an example of every once in a while they do something that really irritate me, where I don't think they're standing up for their own principles. Also, incidentally, they're not exactly the biggest fans of the Second Amendment, even though the Second Amendment is also part of the Constitution. So there's that. So yeah, a little irritating. Any extraordinary measures we use to manage a specific crisis must not become a permanent fixture in the landscape of government intrusions into daily life, declares the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an organization I have been a member of for about 22, 23 years. Love the EFF. They do great work. There are real worries since, as the Foundation notes, life-saving programs such as these and the institutions on digital liberties tend to outlive their urgency. Yes, that can be a problem. That can be a problem. Now, I am somewhat mollified, but not completely, and I understand if you're not either. But I'm somewhat mollified by the idea that this is not our first road that we've been down, where we've dealt with a crisis, where the Constitution has had to adapt to it. And, using legal principles like strict scrutiny, for example, when you're talking about regulating things, right? We can do certain things in times of extreme need that we wouldn't otherwise, using constitutional tools we already have. So it's not like we need to do something different. We can just use the tools we already have, like strict scrutiny, for example. Well, normally the government finding compelling governmental interests is really, really hard. When they're spreading these diseases all over the place, it makes it a little bit easier. So it's not that like the Constitution becomes optional in times of crisis. It's not the Constitution, becomes less valuable in times of crisis. It's that the standard, at least the way I think about it in my own head, the standard that we would use all the time in analyzing these constitutional questions comes out differently in the crisis because the facts are different. As I've said many, many, many times and will again, the law is very fact specific. And so as the need for government, action increases because of an unseen situation, it changes the factual analysis of the legal test we already use. So it's not that we have to adopt a different legal test. It's not that the Constitution changes. It's that how that expresses itself in times of imminent need becomes different because the facts on the ground are different. At least that's how I think about it in my own head, right? So this part of the thing here is saying that we have to be careful the things we're doing right now because of the exigency, because the constitutional analysis has changed in such a way that right now what we're doing right now is legal, right? That we have to be careful that, that we go back as the need also goes back. So we need to make sure that this goes the other way as the facts again change and things change. And we're seeing states starting to do that, I think, in response to the changing of the facts. And so far, it seems like this is happening. So I think this is a prudent concern. I do take some comfort in that this is not our first rodeo. We have been down these kinds of roads before, and it has mostly worked out pretty well, in terms of things. Not necessarily as fast as you'd want to, not necessarily, all the way, but, for the whole, it's been relatively good. But, we should be cautious that these measures we're putting in place are going to be temporary to the need, which hopefully is temporary. So yes, that's kind of the big brain constitutional analysis on that one. Okay. But the extraordinary measures we're seeing are not that extraordinary. They're a little extraordinary, yes. They're a little bit extraordinary, yes. Powerful forces were pushing towards greater censorship and surveillance of digital networks long before coronavirus jumped out of the wet marks in Wuhan, China, and they'll continue to do so once the crisis passes. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah, I do think that there are lots of calls for censorship online, and it's a matter of grave concern. It's also a grave concern as these platforms are gaining more and more traction. They're gaining so much traction in terms of the amount of communication going through them that, again, like the governmental regulation interests start to pop up, by way of example. And it's not a perfect analogy for very obvious reasons. But, during a time when, we just had broadcast television, we had something called the Fairness Doctrine, which required the companies to have people from both political parties on for equal amounts of time, right? And that was abandoned in the late 80s or early 90s. I want to say maybe Reagan, end of the Reagan administration, maybe 89. And that was abandoned. But the logic of it was that these three networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, that was all there was really, right? Have so much control that we have to create a mechanism to have a wider market. And those were upheld by the Supreme Court in the relevant cases. And so it might be that Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and whomever else are gaining so much as platforms, the government interest in trying to make sure those platforms have a wider range of speech may be legitimate, right? So you again are pointing to these cases as analogs, the logic of them as analogs, and showing why it might be. And it would certainly be legitimate for the government to take away CDA immunity as part of a condition of neutrality. Now, how you measure that in a whole bunch of things is a whole bunch of problems. But I think constitutionally it can be done. The government didn't have to grant CDA immunity in the first place. CDA 230 is a thing Congress created. It's a thing they can uncreate, and it's a thing they can make conditional based on, certain criteria. So I think there's a way to do it, but, that's another subject for another day. The practices American tech companies have been undertaking during the pandemic represents not a break, but an acceleration. That I agree with largely as true, but, I say it's of concern, yeah. As surprising as it sounds, digital surveillance and speech control in the United States also already shows some similarities to one might find in authoritarian states such as China. Well, the big difference there is, as so far, they are not coming as a directive of the government. So as concerning as they are to libertarians and free speech advocates and all the rest of it, as concerning as they are, they're not being directed by the government where they are in China. So it's a pretty big difference, right? So you can't make the state action doctrine. If you can make the state action doctrine, it'd be way easier. The United States government was ordering these companies to do things. Then you make a state action doctrine, you get there in a First Amendment law much easier. So to say for private action, because we're assuming they're not state actors, for private action, the ability of the government to require them to cover certain things or to do certain things in certain ways, you have to make different kinds of arguments. And so, but it's a wholly different problem than China, where they are just ordering it by the state. So constitutional and cultural difference mean the private sector, rather than federal and state governments, currently takes the lead in these practices. Yes, they do, which further values and addresses threats similar to those, different than those in China. Okay. But the trend towards greater surveillance and speech control here, and towards the growing involvement of the government, is undeniable and likely inexorable. Yeah, growing involvement of the government is again where things become questionable. As constitutional law professors, I'm sure they already know this, but I'm going to explain it to them anyway. As the government becomes more and more involved, you do wonder about it becoming intertwined and intermingling. And then you worry about the fact that it suddenly becomes state action at some point. If the government is ordering these people to do something, it's state action. If they're encouraging them to do it, state action. So there's definitely a problem there as the government becomes more and more intertwined, as I'm sure they will know. They don't seem to see a problem with that for some reason, but it's a concern, yes. In the great debate over the past 2 decades about freedom versus control of network, China was largely right and the United States was largely wrong. I feel sick just for having recited those words out loud. Significant monitoring and speech control are inevitable components of a mature and flourishing internet. A government must play a role in these practices to ensure the internet is compatible with society's norms and values. Wow. No. Not for the least of reasons that society's norms and values are not exactly a constant thing. Now, there are some values that are pretty constant. For example, freedom of speech itself would be a good example of a value that's pretty constant. That's one of the reasons we baked it in the Constitution. We thought it was pretty important. Yeah, but other than those things that we baked in the Constitution because we thought it was pretty important, and enduring values, perspectives change. And so even if you could censor speech to be reflective of society at a given time, it would prevent society from ever changing. So it would stagnate. So that's, not great. Society has to change. And it should. Now, the speed of change is a interesting item because one of the things that separates a conservative and progressive mindset is the speed of change. It seems to me that both progressives and conservatives in general recognize the same problems and in the current status quo. So both conservatives and progressives seem to, for the large part, recognize the same problems that are ongoing. Although, of course, there are some disputes. But for a large part, they do. What the progressives seem to think is, look at all the ways we can make things better. And what the conservatives tend to think is, look at all the way we can make things worse. So that is the essential divide, right? So a conservative, like a true conservative, would say, well, we should never change anything, but that doesn't work because you're completely stalled where you are. You're calcified, you're stratified, you are locked into a permanent, never changing reality where everything's always the same. And like, well, that's no good, right? So you can't run to the extreme end of conservatism because, like, let's never do anything. That's never going to work. But by the same token, you can't run to the extreme end of progressivism. Let's completely unmoor everything. Everything is completely up in the air. Let's change anything at any time. You know, without any basis or backline. It's just a completely in the extreme version of it. It's completely unhinged, unmoored, unanchored to anything, and so anything can happen anytime. So it's completely chaotic. So that doesn't work either. So you need something in between these two extremes. Now, being a conservative, I tend to favor, the order of the present. I tend to favor the known. I tend to favor the unexperienced. But it's like, even I, it's like, yeah, you got to have change. You can't stay where you are forever. Things are always changing, man. If you follow the Alice in Wonderland philosophy, you're gonna run just as fast as you can just to stand still. That's one of the things that Lewis Carroll is talking about. So that is a thing that exists, but it's like you definitely don't want the government to be able to freeze it so that things will be permanently fixed to a particular society. Yeah. So that's the essential conservative progressive divide. To go to Zachariah's comment. It's not, the conservative doesn't think the status quo works. They just think of all the ways it can go worse. And the conservatives' concern is informed by history, both in the United States and any given state and in the rest of the world and the rest of society. The conservative takes note that it's a lot harder to build anything than to tear it down. Building things of any description is hard. Tearing things down is really easy. So, all of us being equal, you would expect things to go really horribly if you change things. Because there's a lot fewer ways for things to go right than there are for things to go wrong. There's nearly infinite number of ways to burn things to the ground. There's very few ways to build things up. And so the conservative is concerned because of the history of seeing all the way things got burned down to the ground in every possible sense, in every possible domain. The world has been nothing but a constant shit show of complete horror in every possible domain. And the conservative is like, as bad as things are, here's 8,000 ways it can go worse. So let's be careful as we're trying to fix that so we don't break it. Let's not break it as we're trying to fix it. And the progressive just says, well, there's so much horror, we should try bold things. So that's the essential divide, it seems to me. Beginning in the 1990s, the U.S. government and powerful young tech firms began promoting non-regulation and American-style freedom of speech as essential features of the internet. Yeah. They used to call them techno-libertarians. Yeah, the Silicon Valley used to be techno-libertarian. Those days are a little bit behind us now, but yeah. The approach assumed that authoritarian states would crumble in the face of digital networks that seem to have American constitutional values built into them, which is probably true, which is one of the reasons that China has worked so hard to censor the internet. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen instantly. I mean, in the time spans we're talking about, the internet hasn't been around that long. And depending on where you are in the world, it still doesn't exist. It's obviously pretty well adopted, particularly through mobile phones these days. So it's a lot less problem than it used to be. But the amount of time the internet's been around is essentially nothing. So the idea that it would eventually cause authoritarianism to fall still has some merit and it's still a little bit untested, at least in my view. The internet was a vehicle for spreading U.S. civil and political values. More speech would be better, which would in turn lead to democratic revolutions around the world, which arguably has happened, depending on your point of view. China quickly became worried about the unregulated digital speech. Yes, they did. Most of the threat to the Communist Party's control and to domestic social order more generally, which is why they've censored it as hard as they had. I'm willing to bet that this article is not available to read in China. Just going to take a guess. It began building even more popular mechanisms of surveillance and control to meet these threats. Other authoritarian nations would follow China's lead. In 2009, China, Russia, and other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization announced agreement in cooperation in the field of information security. Yeah. The agreement precedently warned of a coming information war in which internet platforms would be weaponized in ways that would threaten social and political systems. Yes. Pretty much, yes. During the George W. Bush and Obama administrations, the United States helped secure digital freedoms for people living in authoritarian states. It gave them resources to support encryption and filter evasive products that were designed to assist individuals in circumventing politically motivated censorship. Yep. As then Secretary of Hillary Clinton put it in 2010. And it openly assisted Twitter and other U.S. platforms that seem to be fueling the Arab Spring. Pretty much true. In these and so many other ways, the public internet in the first 2 decades seemed good for societies, open societies, and bad for closed ones. But this conventional wisdom turned out to be mostly backwards. Really? China and other authoritarian states began to adapt and reverse engineering internet architecture to enhance official control over networks and their populations. Yes, they figure out new ways to control. So yes, it's always a cat and mouse game, trying to figure out new ways to circumvent the things. Yeah. And in recent years, the American public has grown fearful of ubiquitous digital monitoring and reeled from disruptive social effects of digital networks. 2 events were a wake-up call. The first was Edward Snowden's revelations 2013 about the astonishing extent of secret U.S. government monitoring of digital networks in home and abroad. Okay. The U.S. government's domestic surveillance is legally constrained, especially compared with authoritarian states. But it's much less true of private actors. Very true. As much as the CIA, NSA, and the other, how many members of there are the intelligence agency? The other 11, I think. They're 13. It's been a while since I counted. But there's a lot of them. Yeah. So it's been a while, but they are legally constrained. Not as much as we want them to be, but somewhat, yes. Snowden documents gave us a glimpse of the scale of surveillance about our lives on U.S. tech platforms and made plain how the government accessed privately protected data to serve national security needs. Okay. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the point there is. The U.S. government is conducting mass surveillance on the internet. Therefore, we should have a more closed internet. How does that follow? Accepting the premise that the U.S. government is scouring the internet and, looking at all the traffic and watching this stream as I speak. Accepting that premise, why should we have a more closed internet? Wouldn't we just be helping the government do what it wanted to do in the first place? How's this good? Accepting the premise that we live in a surveillance state as sponsored by the many, many intelligence agencies over the United States, how does it follow that we should restrict the internet? I'm not quite sure. Maybe they'll get into it. The second wake-up call was Russia's interference in the 2016 election. As Barack Obama noted, the most consequential mass information campaign in modern history was not particularly sophisticated. It was not some elaborate, complicated espionage scheme. Bourbon is tasty. Russia used a simple phishing attack and blunt and relatively limited social media strategy to disrupt the legitimacy of the 2016 election and wreak havoc on the American political system. The episode showed how easily a foreign adversary could exploit the United States' deep reliance on unguarded networks. It also exploited how legal limitations grounded First Amendment and Fourth Amendment made it hard for the U.S. government to identify, provide, prevent, and respond to malicious service operations from abroad. Not particularly clear how true that would be. The First Amendment's protections apply principally to the United States citizens, and, the United States government not really applicable to what Russia's trying to do. So I think we should have greater network security, particularly as it relates to the channels inside the United States. So if we're talking about having some sort of greater, resilience to internet attacks from foreign actors, that's an interesting discussion. And we can have that discussion as part of it. I still don't see how that leads to censorship or how we should censor things as it relates to ideas, particularly as it comes from Americans. The First Amendment protects we, the people, protects the citizens and the permanent residents of the United States. And, so if we want to prevent Russia from speaking, That's fine. Not as much a First Amendment concern. But, I'm not quite sure how that means we should have a closed, tightly surveilled internet where only like certain positions can be expressed. If I happen to agree with Russia's position, and even without Russia's influence, in the United States, there's 350 million Americans. There are probably some people who happen to agree with Russia on any particular issue, even without Russia trying to influence them. Because, it's not like our interests and Russia's interests are completely disparate. There are some things that we agree on, and there are some things we disagree on, some things we disagree on a lot. And Americans disagree on things a lot. So there's probably some Americans who, on any given issue, agree with Russia. And, those Americans should be allowed to express their view so they can be part of the debate, because maybe our current perspective on any given issue is wrong. That's why we have freedom of speech, so we can engage in the debate. And people who, for whatever reason, would happen to naturally align with Russia on any given issue should be allowed to speak. And then we can have the great debate. And we can see where we line up, and we can see the degree to which we do or do not agree. So, I don't, again, see the point of censoring viewpoints within the United States. The constitutional limitations help explain why, since the Russian electoral interference, digital platforms have been taking lead in combating all matters of unwanted speech on their networks. If anything, can increase their surveillance. I think that they're accepting a premise here that is not being well justified by this article. I think it is not clear to me that the constitutional limitations are preventing the United States government from doing things that would prevent, the Russian or foreign actors from unduly interfering by creating bots or otherwise. And I don't even necessarily object to the extent that the government wants to help Twitter or Facebook or anyone else help to secure their networks. The government may have a lot of knowledge that might be valuable as they're making those decisions. But again, talking about the censorship of ideas, suppressing people's speech is not a follow for me, Just because Russia said it doesn't mean it's wrong, and just because the U.S. said it doesn't mean it's right. That's why we engage in the great debate. All else being equal, I'll trust my country over Russia, but, that's why we have freedom of speech, so people can express their views. "10 years ago, speech on the American internet was a free-for-all. There was relatively little monitoring and censorship, public or private, of what people posted, said, or did on Facebook, YouTube, or other sites. In part, this was due to legal immunity that the platforms enjoyed under Section 230 of the CDA. It sure was. It sure was. And the conservatives who have been looking at this as a mechanism to help insist on free speech by taking away the immunity from people who engage in improper viewpoint-based discrimination, I think it's an idea worth exploring. It's one of those laws you'd want to write really, really carefully because, again, conservatives are extremely concerned about breaking things. There's very few ways to make things better and a lot of things the way to make it worse. But conservatives don't necessarily oppose all change. And so we have seen a problem. We have seen a problem where the tech platforms seem to be censoring speech. And so we are concerned about this problem and we would like to fix this problem. Now, being good conservatives means that we want to be very, very careful about it. We don't want to just pass something on the back of a napkin. We want to make sure that we look at it and try to figure out how to do this without breaking everything. Because we'd like to not break the internet. That'd be great. But, it's probably possible to fix this problem and not break the internet at the same time. So it becomes an issue of how you draft it and how you word it. And the way you do that, again, is by writing some drafts and going through debate and writing some drafts and going through debate and writing some drafts and going through debate. And you try to figure out language that's going to do what you're trying to do without making everything worse. So it can be a little slow, it can be a little tedious, but hopefully at the end, you come up with a result that's going to do what you're trying to do and not break everything at the same time. This was partially because the socialized disruptive networks, various forms of weaponized speech and misinformation had not yet emerged. Well, it amplified everyone's views. That was the whole thing. It took away the gatekeepers or reduced their impact and amplified everyone's views. So everyone was able to speak at much louder volumes, which I think is probably for the best. Because it's not like those views didn't really exist. That's probably good that we understand they exist so we can form a more comprehensive viewpoint. As the networks became filled with bullying, harassment, child exploitation, revenge porn, disinformation, digitally manipulated videos, and other harmful content, private platforms faced growing pressure to use and fix the problems. Well, some of that is already illegal, and some of it can be made illegal. Just because you are doing something online doesn't necessarily make it legal. If you're engaging in child sexual exploitation using online means, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that since it's illegal in the real world, it is or should be illegal online. Just because you suddenly do it online doesn't make it a free for all. The revenge porn is an interesting one on constitutional levels because of its viewpoint-based discrimination, or is arguably so. So the courts are struggling with that, and rightfully so, because it does present a serious First Amendment problem. But they're working on it, and again, it'll take time because we're trying to do this without screwing everything up. So again, it can be a little slow at times, but you try to deal with this. And again, some of the stuff can be made illegal, and some of it can't, to the extent it could be done online. The online makes things easier. It hasn't necessarily changed the nature of things fundamentally, it seems to me. The result a decade later is that most of our online speech now occurs in closely monitored playpens, where mere tens of thousands of human censor reviews flag compliance with ever lengthier and more detailed community standards, or some equivalent, which is concerning. It is concerning watching these tech groups become more and more censorshipist as they engage in things. More and more, the human monitoring and censorship is supported or replaced by sophisticated algorithms, which, is kind of by necessity because of the amount of traffic. Not the algorithms are any good, but, we're working on that too. The firms that use these tools to define acceptable use of speech and other content platforms, which in turn sets the boundaries for great deals of speech in the U.S. public forum. Very, very true. Very true. And an item of concern to everyone, it would hope that anyone's interested in free speech, which apparently these article authors are not, would be interested in the degree to which these bots and these things are censoring ideas, rather than that we want to solve bullying or harassment or child sexual exploitation or other things like that is one thing, but we don't want this to become a tool for censorship of ideas, especially political ideas. So it seems to me that there's ground to want to fix these problems and not make them worse, right? It seems to me. How's everyone doing so far? Is everyone having a good day? Are we enjoying the stream? Please hit like if you are. Super chats, of course, as always, are appreciated. After the 2016 election debacle, for example, tech platforms took aggressive but still imperfect steps to fend off adversaries. I wonder what exactly they mean by debacle. Is it a debacle because Trump won? They're a little unspecific in their language. What made it a debacle in particular? I am drinking bourbon from a wine glass, yes, and it's very tasty and wonderful. Yes, I absolutely am. It also makes judgments about and gives priority to what it calls authoritative voices, which is disturbing. Facebook has developed a multi-pronged strategy that includes removing fake accounts, eliminating or demoting inauthentic behavior. Twitter has a similar censorship policy aimed at platform manipulation originating from bad faith actors located in countries outside the United States. That's fair enough as it goes outside. Yeah. These platforms have engaged in strategic collaboration with the federal government, including by sharing information to fight off electoral interference. Again, that's not necessarily concerning. It's outside speech, outside actors, not necessarily covered by the First Amendment, so it's a little less concerning there. The platforms are also cooperating with one another and with international organizations and sometimes law enforcement on other censorship practices, which is pretty disturbing. This collaboration begins with technology that allows pornography to be assigned a digital fingerprint and placed in databases the platforms draw on to suppress material. Yeah, it's a classic way to deal with that, and it's a fine way to deal with it. A similar mechanism has deployed against terroristic speech. A more controversial practice is to label terrorists often involves inescapable policy judgments. Yes, it really does. But again, to the extent you're talking about foreign actors, that's a little less concerning, yes. Sharing and coordinating across platforms are also moving forward on content related to electoral interference and are being discussed for manipulating videos known as deepfakes. The danger with content cartels, as writer Evelyn Duquette dubs these collaborations, is they diminish accountability for censorship decisions and make invariable mistakes more pervasive and hard to fix. Yeah, they call them content cartels. Content cartels. It's a little hard to say. Which, another name for a cartel in U.S. law is a trust. I liked it better when we called it anti-cartel law because it was a lot clearer what we were talking about. But now we call it antitrust law. But that's what a trust is, a cartel. Yeah, I liked it better when we call them cartels in U.S. law, but now we call it antitrust. So yes, these content trusts are concerned because, again, they seem to be in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, because they relate to an agreement to restrain trade, because everyone is agreeing to do certain things in a collective way. So, a little bit concerning when they're all doing the same thing at the same time. Whatever happened to YouTuber law, Louis Lizer or whatever his name was, I miss that guy. He was trying to do a lawsuit against the FCC, and then he disappeared off the face of the earth. I think he might have had some sort of medical problems or something. Wherever you're out there, man, I hope you come back. I want you back. You were awesome. Please come back. And of course, mistakes are inevitable. Much of the content the platform censor, for example, the child pornography and content that violates intellectual property, is relatively easy and uncontroversial to remove. Great, let's do that. But Facebook, for example, also takes down hate speech, concerning. Terroristic propaganda, a little less concerning if it comes from a recognized organization. Cruel and insensitive speech, what is that? And bullying speech, which are hard to identify objectively and more controversial to regulate or remove. Facebook publishes data on enforcement of its rules. They show the firm makes mistakes, defined by its own flexible criteria, in about 15% of hate cases and 10% of the applied hate speech cases. Okay, so, they recognize their own limits. And again, I think if anything, it's a concern to not go too far. That's what I think about that. JS, I think personally Blue Label is overrated. I like Green Label. But I don't like Scotch that much. I like bourbon, as you know. But I do, and I also like black. I like the traditional black Johnny Walker. I think blue is overrated. But that's my personal opinion. All these developments have taken place under pressure from Washington and Brussels. In hearings over the past few years, Congress has criticized companies, not always in a consistent way, for allowing harmful speech. Yeah, again, because it's part of the great debate, and no one can quite agree on what harmful speech is, which is part of the problem. Yeah. In 2018, Congress amended the previously untouchable 230 to subject platforms to the same liability that non-digital outlets engage in sex trafficking. Yes, and it was very controversial and remains controversial, particularly among left-leaning circles, I might add. It remains controversial. Now, I think it's also controversial as a conservative, because even if you agree with the moral judgment, the ability to administer it becomes a problem. And so, the left has a problem with that change. And so, what are they calling for more censorship when they already have problems with the changes they made, I don't know, man. Additional amendments to 230 are now in the offering. Yes, they are, as various other threats to regulate digital speech. I don't know if I qualify them as a threat, but yes, some of the people are playing around with language to try to force these companies to be open and non-censorship as it relates to ideas. In March 2019, Zuckerberg invited the government to regulate harmful content. In a speech 7 months later, defending the American First Amendment values, he boasted about a team of tens of thousands of people and AI that monitors for fake accounts. Even Zuckerberg's defiant idea of free speech is an extensively politicized space. Yes, it is. Free speech and free expression is pretty politicized. Yes, it is a kind of a deal. Yes. Against this background, the tech firms downgrading outright censorship of speech related to COVID-19 are not large steps. They're a little large, It's a little problematic. Facebook is using computer algorithms more aggressively, mainly because concerns about privacy of users preventing human censorships from working on issues from home during forced isolation. I'm not sure why working from home would matter one way or another when it comes to what they can do. Like, why would it matter if a Facebook censor is working from home or working from inside a business as it relates to like any concerns? What difference does it make? I mean, presumably they're signed into some sort of VPN, and so they're effectively like they have a desktop just like they would be in Facebook, right? So it looks just like they would be on the Facebook campus. So I don't know what the problem is, but yeah. The basic approach to identifying and redressing speech judged to be misinformation has been changed, according to Facebook's head of global policy management. As in other contexts, Facebook relies on fact-checking organizations and authorities to ascertain which content to downgrade or remove. That's concerning too. What is different about speech related to COVID-19 is context. Fair enough. Let's consider if context makes a difference here, because as I was saying a little bit earlier, right, in First Amendment law, right, we have standards of review, like for example strict scrutiny, and it's not that we apply a different standard of review, right? It's just the standard of review comes out differently when we apply it as it relates to speech online, because the facts have changed. So has COVID-19 perhaps changed things here? Fair enough. The problem is huge and the stakes are very high. Debatable. When the crisis is gone, there's no unregulated normal to return to. Sure there is. We live, and for several years we have been living, in a world of serious and growing harms resulting from digital speech. Governments will not stop worrying about these harms, and private platforms will continue to expand their definition of offensive content and will use algorithms to regulate ever more closely. The general trend towards more speech control will not abate. And they might be right. It doesn't show that China was right. It shows that these private organizations want to be, a little fascist. So, that's a concern. And I think it's a legitimate concern of the U.S. government. And, you can use some precedents, as I was talking about, dealing with Fairness Doctrine and some other things like that. The logic of it doesn't quite work, but, you can use the premise of it to adopt new things. And I think the things they're trying to do in 230 makes sense. I'm very, very concerned that they not break 230 while they're trying to fix it. I am very concerned that this be done in a way that's not going to make the problem worse. But I applaud them at least trying. And I applaud them at least putting out language right now. And people have criticized the language that's out there right now, and rightfully so, as part of the process. It's part of the process to put out some language and realize that you're going to be attacked for it and then figure out how to fix it. That's what you're supposed to do in a democratic system. So democracy seems to be working, I guess. Over the past decade, network surveillance has grown in roughly the same proportion as speech control. Indeed, on many platforms, ubiquitous surveillance is a prerequisite to speech control. Well, presumably, yes. Ubiquitous surveillance would be a prerequisite, yes. The public has been told over and over the number of computers we interact with daily collect, emit, and analyze data about who we are, in turn package and exploit in various ways. We also learned a lot, but surely not the whole picture, about the extent to which governments exploit this gargantuan pool of data. The pool is so big, the government has problems with it. And one of the very problems, like the NSA and CIA and everyone else has, is they have so much data, they don't know what to do with it. They've taken the mentality of more data is better, but, it's not good if you can't analyze it. Yeah, I have the chat on ultra low latency, so hopefully the delay between when I say things and when you hear them is pretty low. So hopefully there's not too much of a problem. Police use subpoenas to tap into huge warehouses of personal data collected by private companies. Yes, they do, but the subpoenas are limited. So, you can get a subpoena to, from Google to, give me a particular user's information. But only that particular user, right? So they're limited. Limited in purpose, limited in scope. This is how we solve these problems. The police have access to tools to gain access to doorbell cameras that now align city blocks. Yes, microphones and devices in millions of homes. Private license plate readers that track every car. concerning, yes. And we're trying to figure out a Fourth Amendment theory on that. It's a little bit challenging. Some of the courts have been playing with this Mosaic Theory. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but it's an idea. In short, the idea is that like a collection of otherwise constitutional acts becomes unconstitutional in their aggregate. I don't know if that's going to work or not, but it's something that people are playing with in the courts. They also get access to information collected on smart home devices and home surveillance, a growing share of which include facial corporation to solve crimes. And they pay access to private drone companies equipped with cameras tracking the movements of cars throughout the city. Okay. Yeah, Mosaic Theory is just a theory for a Fourth Amendment idea. It's an idea in Fourth Amendment law, search and seizure law. And as I was saying, it has this name called Mosaic Theory. And like a mosaic where the pieces together, right? In a mosaic, the pieces individually come to form a picture. That's what a mosaic is, right? So the idea of Mosaic Theory is that you can have a collection of information, the individual components of which were lawfully created, but in their combined totality become illegal. So the individual elements, which separately are nothing, together form the mosaic of the completed picture. So they call it Mosaic Theory. It's a theory of limiting government collection under the Fourth Amendment. As I say, some of the courts are playing around with it because they're trying to figure out a way to deal with some of these issues. So yeah, it's called Mosaic Theory. So that was educational, right? Good times. In other cases, federal, state, and local governments openly work in conjunction with the private sector to expand their government's surveillance. One of the most popular doorbell cameras, Ring, which is owned by Amazon. One of the most popular doorbell cameras, Ring, which is owned by Amazon, has forged video sharing partnerships with 400 law enforcement agencies in the United States. Ring actively courted law enforcement agencies by offering discounted cameras to police departments, which offered them to residents. The department then used social media to encourage citizens to download the apparatus. Yeah. Meanwhile, the company Clearview AI provides law enforcement agencies with the ability to scan an image of a face across billions of faces scraped from popular apps. More than 600 law enforcement agencies are now using Clearview. Okay. I mean, again, this is third-party doctrine, right? Your interest in things about you held by a third party are significantly limited at best. And so one of the ways they've been trying to deal with this again is this Mosaic Theory, trying to deal with it. So the courts have been trying to play around with this idea a little bit. So we'll see if it goes anywhere. Yeah. Also, I'm still waiting on the really nice powder that Robert asked me to get. He gave me money for a super chat and asked me to order this really nice powder to help my face look better. And I'm still waiting for it because everything takes forever to get there. But I did put some basic powder on my face to help the shine be a little less glaring. So I just want you to know I'm trying to do things for you guys. So, yeah. The developments are often agreed with blockbuster news reports and indignant commentary, and yet Americans buying surveillance machines and giving their data away. Smart speakers, such as American Expo and Google Home, are about a third of U.S. households. In 2019, American consumers bought almost 80 million new smartphones that can choose among millions of apps that collect, use, and distribute data. The hat's going to be a while, JS. Again, I'm going to the hat's going to take some time, JS. Because I'm going to get a custom fitted hat. So I'm sorry, man, but I have to wait for society to reopen. This isn't on me. This is on COVID. So it's what can we do? Yeah. I put on a little makeup for you guys to reduce the shine. So yeah, it worked out pretty well. Smart speakers such as the Echo and Google Home are about a third of homes. In 2019, American consumers bought almost 80 million smartphones to choose among the apps. Amazon does not release names but it's estimated that 400,000 devices sold in December alone. How is the article? It's not quite as infuriating as I think people were hoping for. Maybe we'll get to the infuriating part. We're on page 8 of 13, but we haven't had any major bust ups because mostly it's just been me like commenting on various things in the article and me saying like, there's some problems here and some things here and like, I'm not sure about this. So like, the we didn't have quite the reaction we did to the let's adopt a new version of originalism, where I like lost my crap. So yes, Texas is coming back. Yes, yes, it is. We're starting to reopen, so I'm very excited about that. It means my hatless days may not be long for this world. Encouraging. It's encouraging. Amazon's private surveillance systems goes far beyond apps, cameras, and microphones. Behind the scenes and unknown to Americans, data brokers have developed algorithmic scores for each one of us, scores that rate us on reliability, propensity to repay loans, and likelihood to commit crime. Yes, for the very few of you who have not yet become members of the Uncivil Law Army, the Uncivilians, the militia, you too can join. There should be a join button somewhere on your screen, somewhere next to the subscribe button. And if you press that join button, you too can get a little green icon and be super, super cool. So that'd be nice. I have to check, but I think I'm up to about 50 members, which is not too bad. Obviously YouTube takes a big cut of that, but it's not bad. We'll do what we can do. Behind the scenes, on Unknown to Americans, data brokers have developed scores. Scores that rate us on reliability, propensity, and likelihood to commit crime. Uber bans passengers with low ratings. Some bars and restaurants now run background checks on their patrons to see whether they're likely to pay a tab and run in trouble. I'm actually going to have to click on that link and check that out. That sounds pretty cool. I'm going to learn more about that. Facebook has patented a mechanism for determining a person's creditworthiness by evaluating their social network. Ooh. These and similar developments are privately functional equivalent of China's social credit ratings, which the critics in West feel so decry. Well, there's one big difference. Well, there's a couple differences between what this is doing and what the. I also like how it keeps changing the color palette on me every time I change my arms. So let me go in here and let me fix the white balance so it doesn't keep changing it because it looks silly every time I move my arms. Okay, now hopefully it won't do that anymore. All right, great. So there is a big difference. There's a couple big differences here. First, in China, it's being done by the state. And the second, even bigger difference in my view is that it's integrated, right? In the Chinese system, the social credit score is an integrated thing. As I understand it, again, because I'm dealing with like third-party articles, because God knows trying to get good information on China, right? But, as I understand, it's a single integrated score. So, like, all the things that can impact it, there's one score, right? So all these various little scores, your credit worthiness, your crime violence rate, your ability to pay bar tabs, all that stuff, right? Right. In some sense, they are the functional equivalent of the big social score, but they're different in that they're not integrated. They're being held by a bunch of different parties and they're relating a bunch of different things, and so they're separated. Now, if your concern is that they might become integrated in the future because all that attractive data, then I totally understand your concern. I think it's a legitimate concern worthy of dealing with. But that's not the situation we have right now. So there are some factual differences here, which is a little bit disparate from what China is doing. Yeah. And now I'm purple. I don't know. I think I look okay. Yeah. The U.S. government, too, makes important decisions based on these privately collected pools. The Department of Homeland Security now requires visa applicants to submit social media accounts for review. That isn't relying on the algorithms of it, though, so much as what you're posting, which, again, goes to a whole bunch of things that they have legitimate questions to ask for. So that's not so concerning. And courts regularly rely on algorithms to determine flight risk, recidivism risk, and more. Yes, to much criticism. A lot of people criticize these algorithms, and rightly so. Some of the numbers they come out with are a little bit questionable. Excuse me. The response to COVID-19 builds on all these trends and shows how technical wizardry, data centralization, and private-public collaboration can be good. As Google and Apple effectively turn their phones into the world's most effective contract tracing tools, I know they're working on it. Yeah, that's concerning too. The ability to accomplish something no other government could. Nearly perfect location tracking the world's most population. That's why governments in the United States and around the world are working to take advantage of these tools that they're offering. I bet they are, and that is a concerning thing. And again, to the degree that we're talking about integration, we raise into public issues and a whole bunch of stuff. Incidentally, I just bought the new Google SE, so I'm excited about my new Google. I've been using Android for 2 years. I bought the Google phone because it was supposed to be the best Android experience, right? I bought the Pixel 3, and I also bought the Pixel 2. And in fact, 3 years I've had an Android phone, and I can't stand it. It drives me crazy. So I'm going back to iPhone. My iPhone SE arrived in the mail. Yeah. Apple and Google have told critics their partnership will end once this pandemic subsides. Facebook has said the aggressive censorship practice will cease when the crisis does. But when COVID-19 is behind us, we'll still live in a world where private firms vacuum up huge amounts of data to collaborate with governments who want access to the data. We'll still continue to opt in to surveillance because of the benefits and convenience. Firms and governments will continue to use the masses of data for various private ends. Yes, this is a long-term issue, a long-term concern, something of concern to me. So, maybe we should do something about it and limit the government's ability to get this data. That might be a solution rather than just saying, "Oh, this is totally cool. Let's do it." Right? I don't. The Pixel 3, man, is just not reliable on me all the time, man. I don't know, man. It just crashes on me sometimes. I don't know. It's just, yeah. The harms from digital speech will also continue to grow as well as speech controls on the network. And invariably, government involvement will grow. At the moment, the private sector is making the most of the important decisions, though often under pressure. Again, depending on what we mean by pressure, that again might be a state action problem. But as Zuckerberg has pleaded, the firms may not be able to regulate speech legitimately without heavier government guidance and involvement. It's also unclear whether the companies can adequately contain foreign misinformation and prevent digital tampering with voting mechanisms without government surveillance. Since almost all the voting mechanisms are pretty old school, you don't need a lot of protection. And so one of the benefits of having voting being done by every county and every voting district individually, it's a little hard to hack into. I don't even know how many different voting districts there are. A lot. 40,000? I don't know. But yes, yeah, it's a little hard because the technology is so different in so many places. So that's kind of a nice benefit. The First and Fourth Amendments, as currently interpreted, and the American aversion to excessive government-private sector collaboration, yes, there is a line where you reach into state action. There is a line under the current law, or Facebook, Twitter, everyone else can become a state actor. It can happen. So yes, there is a problem there. Has stood as barriers to greater government involvement. Yeah, a little bit. Americans' understanding of these laws and cultural norms they spawn will be tested as social costs of relatively open internet multiply. I mean, under current law, it's, again, if anything, I think you'd want to do more to open it up versus the other way around, but it's a concern. It's a concern. COVID-19 is a window into the future struggles. As to that, you might be right. You might very well be right. And that would pose a good lesson for us all as we're looking into the future, trying to figure out what might happen. It's what's happening right now might be the future because it's provided an excuse for some people. So, it's hard to disagree with that. I'd take the lesson and, take it the other way, but, you can't disagree with the conclusion. At the moment, activists are pressing Google and Apple to build privacy safeguards in their contract tracing. Yes, there is a concern. Yet legal commentator Stuart Barker has argued the companies are being too protective. The existing private accommodations will produce a design that raises far more barriers to effectively tracking interactions. And even some of these ordinary privacy-loving European governments seem to agree with the needs even for the sake of health. But the extent to which they'll agree is unclear. Yes, again, under the same constitutional analysis we usually use, the imminence of the current situation provides a different rationale. So it's a fact-based rationale. So I'd imagine, all things being equal, like the governments in Europe are being roughly the same. I mean, I understand they don't all derive from the same common law, right? But I'd have to imagine that they would abide by roughly the same principles, that, health concerns will give them extra power they wouldn't normally have. Now, some people will seize onto that and hold it forever, including some European governments we can name. But, the concern is fine there. We are set for 9 p.m. Eastern. I do not mind if you advertise it to my audience. That's fine, yes. Barney and I will be talking tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern time on Nate Brody's channel. We will be talking about conservative versus progressive principles and conservative versus progressive philosophy. And we'll be talking about some, the major issues: gun control, abortion, talking about universal basic income, tax policy, all the things that don't matter, right? So it might be interesting. So yeah, feel free to go to Nate Brody. He wanted to have a conversation. I'm happy to talk with anyone about anything, not for least reasons I might learn something. And I'm happy to have my views challenged, as long as it's done in a respectful way. I'm happy to talk to anyone who has a view and education and and will treat me with respect. If he calls me a fascist or insults me, I'm going to hang up on him tomorrow. So, but, short of that, I'll be happy to engage in conversation with him. And we'll see if I learn anything and he learns anything. I want to go with a Jordan Peterson philosophy of assuming the person I'm talking to has something valuable to say. So we'll, engage in that and see what happens. Could be interesting. So 9 p.m. tomorrow on Nate Brody's channel. Be there if you're into that. It's a little off brand for this channel, so that's why we're not doing it here. We're about to find how this trade-off will be managed in the United States. The surveillance and speech controls responses of COVID-19 and private sector's collaboration with government in these efforts are a historic and very public experiment about how the constitutional culture will adjust to our public future. Okay, so that was much less stupid than I thought it would be from the headline. I thought it was much less stupid than it would be from the headline. But, so I think there's some legitimate things of concern here. There's some legitimate things. There's concern. There's concerns everywhere. As again, to quote Jordan Peterson, the way he'd put it is he'd say there's snakes everywhere, which I kind of like too. It's like there's snakes everywhere. There's danger everywhere. There's dangers in not doing things. There's dangers in doing things. It's just trying to figure out what to do. And the concern to which the government should or should not have power is concerning. And the degree to which the government's interacting with these things is concerning. So, it's all concerning. But, I think the general thesis of what they're saying is correct. They seem to welcome it. I don't welcome it, but I can't argue with what they're saying is happening. They seem to think it's a good thing, and I seem to think it's a bad thing. But I can't disagree with what they're saying. They think the tech industry, if I'm reading the article correctly and I'm summarizing correctly, I want to be fair to my article I'm reading. If I'm reading it correctly, they say that, these companies, when they existed, were first techno-libertarian. And they were. It was very techno-libertarian. It was very free speech. And since then, it's been a little bit more open. HRK of 250, which is a huge contribution. Thank you very much, Barney. Tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Nate Brody's channel on civil law, as U.S. conservative, will be talking to me, U.S. progressive liberal, intended as cooperative discussion of both sides of islands and oceans. Thank you very much for the contribution, and thank you for discussing it. Should be very interesting. But the thesis is that, these tech companies that were started techno-libertarian, which I think is very true. In recent years, they've become much more aggressive with censorship, which is very true. We can see that on Reddit versus the Donald. We can see that on Facebook. We can see that on Twitter. We can see that with a lot of the different policies that exist. Yes, they become a lot more concerning. So that's true. And so it will become increasingly true that they'll do it more, and government will look to those resources to help them in their quests. So I think that's all very, very true. And that those things will tend to happen. So, Oh, no, I don't think Nate's calling anyone a fascist. No, I don't think so. No, absolutely not. Now, Nate Brody, let me give a link to his channel. Hold on. He's another YouTube lawyer. He has a channel size about the same as mine. But let me find his thing, and I'll put it in there so you can go to his link. He has 4,500 subscribers, so he's a little bit lower than me because I'm about almost 7,000. This was a little bit lower than me, but it's close. So I'll give you a link to his channel. Yeah, that's a link to the channel. So you can check that out. Tomorrow at 9 p.m. should be pretty interesting. So yeah, I think all things considered, it's a pretty good article. There's a lot that's going on here that I agree with. I think it's a bad thing that this is happening. I think the government wants to try to intervene here to prevent some of this from happening. I'm very concerned about viewpoint discrimination. I'm very concerned about voices being taken off on the web. I'm very concerned when two doctors who seem to be reputable and seem to be expressing nothing more than the view that they think that the current lockdown we have has gone too far. Their views are taken down the web. I'm very concerned about that. And there's a lot to be concerned about here. So, but they seem to think it's a good thing, and that's what we are. So, and until later, my friends, I'm going to sign off. I hope all is well. I hope you enjoyed this little stream. Sorry it wasn't quite the blow up fest we all anticipated. I just don't think that they all their logic is fundamentally right. I just think it's bad, and they seem to think it's good and inevitable. So I can't agree with that. But it is an item of concern. And until later, my friends, I'm gonna sign off. I hope you're well. Until later, cheers and goodbye.